Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Joe Serra. I'm the moderator for today's session. Thank you very much for attending. A couple things we should talk about. First is everyone's muted, so keep the noise down and the chatter down. So if you have any type of questions, please put them in the chat option and we'll get to those at the end of the session. Today we have Matt Ross from STI and Liam Degman from Compliancy Group. Today we're going to talk about, next slide, compliance fundamentals. The last session we have a series of these. We talked about the legal requirements for HIPAA to maintain security of your data. And today we're going to talk about what happens once you begin that process and how you can stay compliant, as well as what the government's going to ask you if in fact you are ever audited. And by audited, we mean you have a data breach. So that's going to be put on by Liam and his group. Also, the biggest threats today, including breaches in healthcare landscape and completing the required HIPAA IT security risk analysis. Then we're going to move over to the cost of non-compliance and do a little cost-benefit analysis for you, and try to get your mindset away from being once and done with compliance and realizing it's an ongoing process. So that being said, I'll be back later to handle questions, but let me introduce Liam Degman, who's in sales with the Compliancy Group. It's all yours, Liam.
Awesome. Thanks for having me, Joe. Thanks for having me, Matt. I think the content that I'll be covering here today is focused on giving everybody here some fundamental understandings, not only as far as what you need to be considering for things like your HIPAA compliance program. We'll also be talking about some of the key risks that we come across. And what I hopefully want you coming away from this session with is just a clear understanding as far as what would you actually be asked for if you had a breach and you were being audited by the government. What are the most common pitfalls and what are the risks that we're seeing today? Quick introduction on Compliancy Group. If you go to the next slide, Compliancy Group has been around for about 20 years. We have roughly 3,000 practices that we work with all throughout the country. In the history of our business, we have never had one of our customers fail any type of a government audit, an investigation, or be fined following a breach or an HHS OCR audit. And I mentioned that genuinely not as a sales pitch, but as kind of more so kind of just lending some credibility to the things we're going to be talking about today. Is these are not things that we just came up with for the sake of a webinar. These are things that we have proved out with our customers over the last 20 years, hundreds of them having gone through federal HIPAA audits. We've never had one fail. We are endorsed, if you go to the next slide, Matt, we are endorsed by over 40 different major medical associations and specialties because of that. And so as we're going through here today, again, my goal is just to hopefully share some of that wisdom that we've gained from our experience in the industry. And a lot of that begins with something that's called the 7 elements of an effective compliance program. And so depending on who you are and depending on your experience with things like HIPAA compliance programs, I think the most important question to answer is, what does it actually mean to be HIPAA compliant? And HIPAA as a reg, the way that it's written is intentionally broad and very vague because of that, because you're dealing with a regulation that has to apply to a small single solo provider practice all the way up to the largest regional hospital system in the country. And the laws don't change, right? It's the same rules and regs that apply if you are a very small practice, that would apply if you are a very large hospital system. And this framework of requirements that you see here, these 7 elements come directly from HHS and the Office of Inspector General as their boilerplate expectation of what should be included in your compliance program. And so you'll see references to a lot of the things that people commonly think of when they think about compliance, which might be policies, training, risk assessment, incident management. The thing that I want to just draw your attention to here before we move on to the rest of the content, though, is that word effective. I think universally, one of the major pitfalls that we come across, especially among smaller practices, is they are going through the process of evaluating their needs for HIPAA compliance, and they think that what is effective for them is, well, I'm a small practice, maybe I don't need to do a risk assessment, or I'm a small practice, maybe this thing doesn't apply to me. When really what the government wants to see that you're doing is that you're satisfying all of these standards, but doing it in a way that actually is impactful, that in a way that makes sense for your business. And so one of our customers a year or two ago went through an OCR audit after they had a breach. And if you go to the next slide, Matt, you can click maybe to the second page of this audit here. One of the things that you'll see that will happen in the event, let's say that you have a breach and the government is notified of it in some way, shape, or form, they're going to ask you a question, like question number one there. So they're asking you, well, tell us what happened, right? Give us a narrative as far as what actually gave rise to you having a breach or a violation. These letters can also be kicked off from things like patient complaints that are filed against you with HHS. But that second question there is, I'm going to say, like, what is going to be the linchpin here for everything else that I talk about in my segment, which is they will ask you 100% of the time, the first question that they'll ask is they'll want to see a copy of your risk analysis, or your also called security risk analysis or security risk assessment for HIPAA specifically. By and large, that is the number one thing that we come across that practices are missing, is they have maybe a portion of an assessment that was done, or maybe they have a document that was given to them as like a checklist from a couple years ago, but it hasn't been maintained, it hasn't been looked at in some time. And you'll see that following that assessment question, they then begin asking you for proof of all of these other things that you've done, right? So the whole purpose of, let's say, like a HIPAA risk assessment is to figure out, well, what do we actually need as a practice? Where are our gaps in compliance? And what have you done now to fix those gaps? And that's question 3 there, is evidence of the security measures implemented to actually address the risks and vulnerabilities identified in that risk assessment report. And then they ask about policies. If you go to the next 2 pages there, Matt, you'll see a lot of the asks then, it all says, show us evidence, give us evidence. Many practices, they look at the HIPAA requirements and in their mind, they think, we are doing this thing, but in the eyes of the government, it's not really about what you're doing in practice. It's about what you're able to prove on paper. And to really drive this point home, if you go to the next slide, Matt, roughly 80% of all of the HIPAA fines that have ever been levied cited missing risk assessment documentation for exactly this reason, because either the assessment wasn't on file or else they had an assessment, but the trouble, right, is even if you've done a risk assessment, your risk assessment report by itself is incriminating unless you can also prove how you've actually been addressing the gaps that were found in that assessment. And so that kind of like holistic lifestyle of doing an assessment, identifying gaps, documenting how you're fixing them, and actually implementing the things that will be necessary to address your risks, that is how you get yourself ready, right? That's how you not only make yourself ready in the event that there is an audit following a breach, it's how you prevent a breach from happening in the first place, right? And that's why the government tends to ding so many people for this particular issue. You can mitigate an awful lot of your risk just by engaging in this process and addressing the findings from it. And so for those of you that are on here and you feel like you're kind of starting from a clean slate as far as compliance is concerned, you don't have a ton of experience in this area, just by doing that assessment, I think will give you the confidence to know, where do I go from here? What policies do I need? What do I need to implement from an IT perspective? How should I be training my employees? All of that is covered in a risk assessment. And nowadays, the kind of modern risk profile, if you go to the next slide, Matt, I want to emphasize this here because one of the things that's happened is, especially as healthcare has modernized, you would think that, you know, the modernization of healthcare environments, the movement to the cloud, the more advanced tools that we have would result in fewer breaches. But in the healthcare industry, particularly, things have never been worse. So just in the last 3 years, there's been a 300% increase in individual records breached. And the HIPAA security rule was originally introduced in 2009. You could see it was virtually non-existent back then, because in order to have a breach, you might have had to have literally a file cabinet stolen out of your office, right? Nowadays, everything is digital, and because everything is digital, it is more easily accessible if you're not locking these things down in the right way. If you go to the next slide, 2024 healthcare data breaches, I'll highlight this particularly. 67% of the breaches were found to be at the fault, not of the actual healthcare provider, but of a vendor that you were working with. And that maybe that vendor was not set up properly, or maybe it was the vendor that had a breach on their end, but it included your patient's information, which creates a lot of liabilities for you as well. And so part of what we need to be thinking about in a modern healthcare environment is, what are the risks that are going to be most relevant to you? Nowadays, a lot of that is cloud services, right? It's a lot of digital information that's very accessible to a cyber predator if there was a mistake to happen. And beginning to address those things starts, if you go to the next slide, with a very clear view of your risks as a company, which you can only get if you're engaging in that risk assessment process. And so I want to be really clear that, like, if you're not doing that HIPAA risk assessment, you will not only not know what you ought to be doing for compliance, you're not satisfying a fundamental requirement of the law, right? And HHS says that that's foundational. If you go to the next slide, Matt, the goal here is that you're proactively identifying risks, putting things in place then to assess them, right? Like, unique to your practice, what should we be doing, so that you can then address them and monitor them on an ongoing basis, right? This is by no means like a one and done type of a thing. This is something that should become a part of how your practice operates. And so that is a lot of the content that I had to cover for the sake of this session today. Matt, I'll let you take it away for some of the more practical side of things you were going to cover.
Liam, thank you, and good afternoon, everyone. We appreciate everybody's attendance today. It seems all too often from anything related to compliance, and Liam was just very clear into the importance of compliance overall within the organization. But the compliance officer, if you will, seems always to be that one person that just has to add it on to their piles of things to do. In fact, compliance is usually not their #1 responsibility. Yet when things go wrong, they're always called to the carpet as to why you didn't complete this or how come it wasn't done. It is an arduous task to complete the requirements for compliance within your organization. It's one of the reasons why we at STI have partnered with the compliancy group for many, many years, is because we've acknowledged the importance of compliancy overall, from policy adherence to something that I want to talk to everyone about is more so the technical aspects within the security risk assessment of your compliance plan. There's 7 effective steps. Compliance is ongoing. It requires detail. It requires discipline. It requires follow through. There is a starting point though, and that is that security risk analysis. Now, but what is the security risk analysis? Liam's talked about it. I'm going to talk about it a little bit more. How do you start it? Where do you go for help? Now, without going into the details and getting caught up into the governmental policy sightings, the SRA really is that roadmap, right? It will help you identify areas of conformity in your organization, as well as those vulnerabilities. And Liam's talked about that, and certainly the scare tactics that are very, very real that we all are observing today. Where you're going to go to develop a plan, where you're going to take actions to maintain one. And as we saw through the OCR, worst case is at least being able to prove that you have one. And while the Health and Human Services provides some flexibility within the law of an SRA pertaining to its creation and its maintenance, it's really made up of 7 core sections within the SRA. There's 116 different questions that can get posed to you, and it includes what your answers are to these questions and the priority and the importance within your company. Now, there's no doubt that it's going to be overwhelming, and many times it gets backburnered, not by intention, but simply lack of time. And through our own organization, when we talk to our clients about, did you complete, for an example, a backup? Only those individuals or practices or businesses that have experienced an outage really start to understand the importance of making sure they have provisions in place to protect themselves for something that they hope will never happen going forward. So the costs of non-compliance, what are they? Well, some are pretty evident, but we never really get into the details of it because we really don't want to address the reality of what could possibly be. So let's talk about a parallel comparison. We've been talking about healthcare, and we certainly are going to talk about healthcare, but it does impact all industries, not just healthcare. And here at STI, we receive content daily on notices, breaches, settlements. I'm sure Liam the same. Recent information from public breach notifications and the American Bar Association. With each attack, there is some resulting lawsuit. So I thought, you'd think attorneys would be the most knowledgeable about risk. However, millions of client records have been compromised in the legal field. So I thought it would be interesting to share just some information, maybe from the depth and the breadth, to take your business, whether it be outside of the industry of healthcare, but just applying that going forward, and you look at the associated costs with just simply paying the ransomware, but are you taking into consideration the downtime, not days, not weeks, typically months of lost income in fees and expenses that you have to pay? Not to mention, in the cases with just these legal firms, the amount of client lawsuits. And in fact, with this Massachusetts firm, they had 2 class action lawsuits involving 13,000 clients. The number of legal cases with these companies, these law firms, and the number of settlements of cases have been lost because of the inability to recover data. And that impacts whether it be a medical practice, an insurance agency, an accounting firm, and certainly within healthcare. What was interesting in these cases, and apply it to your own business, is that there's an inability, or there has been an inability, to recover evidence for files that led to case dismissals. And many of these firms, and this is true to the healthcare industry, have been forced to have to close their business. So now, to apply that to the medical specific community, in all of these cases, as Liam has expressed, this is recent information coming from OCR and HHS, is that the #1 element in all of these cases, as we have seen, is failure to produce documentation that you've been able to complete necessary steps. And unlike the legal industry, healthcare has a little bit of a twist to it because it has to do with our health. And the government can impose fines up to $2.13 million per violation if you are willingly neglecting to follow what you're supposed to do. In addition to that, in the healthcare segment, the government itself has regulatory actions through the government, through state and FTC investigations for injuncture, and last is criminal prosecution. So not putting the attention into focusing on compliance, and specifically from a risk perspective, analyzing and conducting the step one of the cybersecurity risk assessment. So I'm sure you get it by now, right? You've got to do the SRA. I mean, it's not just smart, it's legally required. It prepares you to take an action to protect the patient data. It reduces that possibility of a fall from some cyber attack. And if you do, unfortunately, go through a situation of some kind of exposure, you're at least going to be able to demonstrate to those agencies that you are doing something, that you're not being negligent in your actions. Now, while I've been talking, maybe even so much so, too much about the importance of doing the SRA, quite honestly, that is probably, although Liam and I could probably have some discussions over it, just the starting point, and maybe least important when you look at the overall scope, right? So here at STI, what do we do for our clients? What do you need to do as an organization? Is you need to have network management. Our philosophy: monitor, manage, prevent. The most important part of any compliance plan is just that, and that's what we do at STI for our clients. We're a healthcare specific managed service provider, and if we can do it in that industry, certainly we can support our other neighboring commercial clients. So completing that security risk analysis shows you how to take the test. Now you need to know how to pass the exam and protect yourself. You need a qualified healthcare organization that can help support you that. Now, what do we do through our network management and us as a managed service provider? We utilize tools such as what were provided through the compliancy group, but most importantly is we manage your infrastructure. We make sure that servers, your network, cloud systems in themselves are all being managed correctly with proper tools. Cybersecurity applications are installed on firewalls. We can identify and determine threat detection issues. In addition to just the tools, we have our own help desk. We support our clients in troubleshooting applications above and beyond the potential for risk or a breach. We help our clients through those backups and the disaster recovery planning should there be an issue, even unrelated to a cyber breach, but just the normal reality of something mechanical will break down. We assist our clients through IT planning. The endpoint management of desktops and tablets is something not to be forgotten. In fact, I want to talk to you briefly about that and making sure that your patches are being done on all your equipments. Some of you that may or may not be aware is just recently in October, Windows 10 is no longer supported. So for those of you that are using outdated Windows equipment, such as Windows 10 or earlier, not only are you vulnerable to an attack, you're actually out of compliance that will put you at greater risk, certainly with what Liam's shared with us today. But I want to share something with you that I think is probably, it is real world, and this is something that we experience, unfortunately, all too often. Just recently, this week, in fact, we had a medical client that over the weekend, our systems identified an intrinsic attack upon a PC. That PC then infected all its associated PCs on its network. Our endpoint solutions isolated the whole network, in essence, put up walls, shut it down, and prevented that client from having a HIPAA breach. With the associated backups, we're able to get and eradicate the malicious infections, get them back up online with minimal downtime. And again, regretfully, these things are happening all too often. And Liam's slide, quite honestly, is the truth. In fact, there's too much understanding or misunderstanding that the cloud is going to give you greater support. Quite frankly, the facts are the cloud has created greater exposure because of its simplicity. And as recently as this week, we received notices from our network admins hearing information from our team that gets passed to our whole organization of seeing 130 million of potential events is an ongoing basis that our systems are able to eradicate. So, what do you do next? Well, there's no better time than now. By having a security risk analysis, those are those first steps. You need to do that, understand, come up with a baseline, and then you need to go from that perspective forward and making sure you put the right tools in place through managed services, compliance effectiveness, using the compliancy group for assisting on HIPAA privacy, and organizations like us at STI to help from a technical perspective on things that are beyond the scope of your sister's brother's cousin that thinks he or she knows IT. This industry is well beyond that, and you need to do something about that today. And we're proud to offer a security risk assistance review starting at $1,500 and until the end of this year, not just for our security risk analysis to assist our clients with and you, is to also discounts in our managed services of 10% until the end of the year. And you should take advantage of that. And if you have interest, our contact information will be provided at the end of the session. So in short, with those 7 key elements, with trusted partners like the Compliancy Group and STI, will help you implement policies, assess those risks, train and educate, and detect offensives and enforce standards. So we thank you for attending our program today. Joe, do we have anyone with any questions?
Yes, I have a couple, but before we do, let me try to summarize all of this. This is an ongoing process, and all the practices and other businesses have to address this. Cybersecurity and data breaches are, as we've shown you, are just continuing. I like to use an analogy of a 4-legged stool. You have to have all 4 legs to stay stable. The first one obviously is the risk analysis. Without that, if you have a data breach, you're just completely have no defense at all against the federal government coming after you. And you spent years working on building a business. You don't want to lose all of that in with one small mistake that may not even be your fault. But once you do the risk analysis, you're not done. You need to have compliancy, and the compliancy group, that's their job, is to make sure that once you do risk analysis, it stays up to date and that your staff is trained on how to avoid data breach. And we find that most data breaches do come from human error, not from any other reason, but someone making a mistake and clicking on a malicious email or letting someone into a system without knowing what they are doing. The third leg of that is, as Matt mentioned, monitoring. You need to monitor your network constantly to avoid having that type of a breach. And that's being done through software at STI. And a fourth leg of that stool is cyber insurance. Next slide, please, Matt. Our next program in February is going to be about cyber insurance. If the whole idea is not to have a data breach, but if you do have one and you don't have insurance, it's enough to basically put a small business or a small medical practice out of business. So you have to have all 4 of those pieces, and we'd like to talk to you about that. The reason we're doing the risk analysis is we want to get you not only the risk analysis done, but a quote from STI to handle your managed services, and a quote from the compliancy group for compliancy training for your staff. Question-wise, there is one on the cost of compliancy groups charges for small medical practice. You want to take that one, Liam?
Yeah, I can cover that, Joe. So all of our pricing is publicly available. So if anybody wanted to just go to our website, it's compliancygroup.com. You'll see our different plan options and pricing options on there. We have plans for very, very small practices that start as low as $99 a month, plus a cost per employee. And that'll cover you for ongoing tracking and management of a lot of these things, especially as it concerns like your policies, your employee trainings, different requirements for documentation. We basically document everything that you're doing for compliance all throughout the year. So you could check out all the different plan options on there.
Here's a second question. If we have a BAA with our partners, does that protect us from fines from the federal government?
So especially thinking through that statistic we talked about earlier about how most of the breaches are at the fault of a vendor or a business associate, the BAA is definitely going to be the most important thing as far as protecting yourself from a HIPAA liabilities point of view. But I would say that it's only the first step, right? Because depending on who you're using and the level of access that those vendors have to PHI, it's part of the risk assessment is also documenting the security of those, let's say, cloud applications specifically that could have patient information in them. And so the BAA is super important. Make sure that you have that with any services you're using that could be coming in contact with patient data, but also then make sure you're going to that next step to actually assess them and make sure that there's proper protections in place on your end as well as theirs.
Here's one last question, probably for you, Matt. How does software protect data breaches? How does it physically work?
Yeah, so thanks to that individual that asked a question. So from a perspective of what we offer here at STR Managed Services, there's kind of twofold. So the applications, the solutions that we install on our client systems are just one component of two. So the software that helps us at least identify issues and also prevent intrusions is important, but we've got the staff behind it, like that one example that I presented to you, of not just letting a system show a flag or a problem, but identifying, do we have a real issue and how we need to address that. So I would say a tool is critical, like some of you might have a virus system, but you need not just the tools and those applications, but you've got to have an actual human being, a team behind you that has the depth to understand how that will prevent you from a potential risk or what is a real risk going forward. Hope that helps answer.
That's the last question, Matt. I want to thank everybody for attending today. I'll leave this screen up for a few minutes if you want to copy down some email addresses or phone numbers, and I'm sure that we'll be in contact with you. And if I don't talk to you again, have a nice holiday. And this is our last webinar for 2025. Please join us next year. We have a whole set of programs on managed services set for next year. And thank you for attending.